Be the Talk, episode 371, featuring Kyle Herron. Welcome to Be the Talk. We go behind the talk 7 days a week for tips and techniques to help you change the world. I'm Nathan Eckel, and a talker myself. I'm interviewing others who change the world with their talk. You can too, even if you've never given a talk before. Let's get started with today's show. We are live with Kyle Herron. Kyle, are you ready to talk?
Oh, I'm so ready.
Kyle Herron doesn't want to just build a company. He wants to create a movement. Kyle is focused on catalyzing independence, innovation, and entrepreneurship. All in all, Kyle shatters any image that may exist of an unmotivated millennial generation. Kyle Herron, welcome to the talk.
Well, it is an absolute pleasure to be here. And I have to say, for only practicing that bio once, it sounded pretty good.
Your talk is called More Than Solo Cups and Studies. And I love your talk because you really take this idea, and I can say this as a former adjunct faculty. I've been in the college world from both sides, and I really think that you're on to something, kind of pulling the clothes off the emperor that doesn't have any clothes, so to speak. And your talk is all about how you spent your first year at a nice school, went out and had kind of sounded like a pretty traditional college experience, and you realized it wasn't serving you, and also you maybe didn't make the best choices that you could have, and then you decided the next year to do the unthinkable, which is otherwise known as community college for a lot of us. And if you grew up, hey, I grew up with a fair amount of privilege, so I got to go to a private school, and I remember especially 25 years ago when I was going to school, there was almost a stigma with community college. But as you mentioned in your talk, it's the best bang for your buck, and you get to learn for the sake of learning instead of being distracted with everything other than studies. You get to meet real people, you get to enjoy diversity, and you get to have a real world experience. Kyle, please take us behind the talk.
Well, first of all, let me start again by saying, Nathan, it is a pleasure to be here, and I do appreciate you taking the time out for me to join you on your show. I'm 25 now. I gave that talk when I was 18, and I was in a much more vulnerable stage of my life. And I think if that talk represents anything, it represents the power of transparency, because I was absolutely blown away to see the response from something that I felt was just like an anecdote of my personal story. Right. But what really had brought that to life was coming out of high school, I had no idea that anyone would ever challenge one of the biggest institutions in our country, which is the educational system. And now, of course, 7 years later from them, we've got Gary Vaynerchuk, Peter Thiel, Elon Musk constantly saying that maybe college isn't the right path. And for me, I discovered that after only 6 months of being at my first school. Ultimately, I really fell into a lot of the societal traps of you have to go to college regardless of whether you think it's the right fit for you, regardless if you really identify with it, regardless if it really fulfills you. And so after being at that first school for a couple months, I felt none of those things. And inevitably, the question was raised of, am I in the right place? But of course, like any other gung-ho college student raised in a fairly conventional white male privileged environment, I knew that the most taboo thing that I could do was to walk away. And yet that decision was ultimately made. But really, I think what's more interesting, and I think you touched on this, Nathan, is what I decided to do after. The first collegiate experience, was no different than anybody else's college experience. But the decisions I made after were the ones that took me on a totally unconventional trail. And that trail started for me in community college and landed now in entrepreneurship. And really, I found that those two had more parallels than what I had realized before. I mean, I think the problem with a collegiate environment is that and I was reading an article about this a few days ago, it trains you to be really good at doing one thing, and that's following someone else's structure. Now, when you enter into the realm of community college for the first time, no one is really telling you that you have to do anything. And the biggest risk you're taking is maybe losing a couple $100. So for the first time, it's a fully self-motivated path. And so that created this new sense of independence, vigor, and this drive to be myself. And that's
funny because the biggest risk in in exchange for the loss of some kind of perceived prestige that may or may not really exist. You're taking the risk of saving tens and tens of thousands of dollars.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It's such a funny statement. I love it.
Well, and you know what I find interesting is that ultimately, here's the problem, Nathan, is that we're supposed to take on this risk that you just had mentioned, this multi-$1,000, $100,000 risk, before we have like even the slightest sense of who we are as people, much less what we want to spend our life doing. So we have this massive burden that's put onto our back as 17, 18-year-olds. And it's not surprising that people walk out of college feeling unfulfilled, and next to being unfulfilled, walk out with $250,000 in debt.
And it's crushing. I mean, the cognitive load and the psychological load and just the capacity that all of us have to have a quarter life or a 20% life crisis because you're like, it's like a Talking Heads lyric. How did I get here? You might ask yourself, how did I get here? Well, I followed the crowd. I did maybe what my parents told me to do, or society, or I followed the expectations, and here I am, and I've got unforgivable student loans.
Mm-hmm. And you know what that has now turned into? That crowd has now shifted into a multi-trillion-dollar debt market. And for me, I knew that not only did I have zero interest in being a part of that crowd, but more so than that, I had no interest in what I ultimately realized is that I had no interest in being in a collegiate environment. I had the most interest in being within my own environment. And what I mean by that is I recognized that during my high school experience, one of the biggest things I was missing was time to do real, honest self-work, to get a better understanding of who I am and to become friends with myself, a challenge that so many of us face at various stages of our lives. For me, it just so happened that I was facing this crisis at 19 or 20 years old.
Well, and good for you for diving right into that bridge. I mean, we've all got to cross the bridge. And many of us, college or whatever it is, we'll find all kinds of, hurdles and quests and rites of passage to avoid doing what you mentioned, just to find out who we are and do the really hard work of looking inward a little bit to find out what motivates us, what doesn't, and whether we have the courage to at least admit what doesn't motivate us and go out there and try to find a way, beat a path to what does motivate us and is going to allow us to really make our mark in the world.
And frankly, I really did feel like, looking back at my journey, community college was that place where I had that self-incubation type of experience, and was able to, for the first time, as I said, not only have anybody else, holding any requirements over my head, but more importantly, I could fail fast, and I could fail hard, and I could get up and I could try something new really quickly. That was the advantage of being in that community college environment, because at that point, you're not really required to declare a major. You're not required to stick to an extremely tight class schedule. You're taking some general education courses. But for the most part, you get this huge period of introspection and defining your path by trying a couple different paths. And so ultimately for me, I think it was a combination of the fact that, number one, I had all of this freedom to work on myself and to get to know myself. But number two, there's an innate sense of self-drive when you're in a setting like that, where you walk into a classroom as a 19-year-old kid and you're with full-time mothers, full-time workers, and full-time students, and some that were doing all three. And so immediately, if you've never experienced what it's like to really embrace humility, that is the place to do it, because for the first time you realize you're not that great, you obviously don't work that hard, and you don't have that many challenges, so why are you not great in life yet? That was the question I asked myself looking around at my classmates.
Well, we've been enjoying this conversation with Kyle Herron. His talk is called More Than Solo Cups and Studies, and we're going to be right back with Kyle Herron for the Blitz Round in just a moment. And we're back. It's time for the Blitz Round with Kyle Herron. His talk is called More Than Solo Cups and Studies. I'm going to ask Kyle a series of either-or questions related to the preparation and performance of his talk. Kyle, are you ready?
Let's do it.
All right. Were you invited to speak, or did you apply?
I was invited.
Did you memorize, did you improvise, or did you blend in preparation?
It was about 99% improv.
No kidding.
Yep.
No kidding. Wow. So not even much of an outline then.
Maybe 95% is a more fair number.
I mean, well, an outline is more than 5%. So you had, I mean, not part of what we're doing here for Talk Universe is trying not to.
No, let me rephrase.
Go ahead and rephrase that. What does 99% improv mean to you?
I say 99% because for there was never a minute where I knew what I was going to say. I knew what I was going to talk about, though. And I wanted to speak from a place of, like I said, a place of vulnerability. I wanted to come from a place of honesty and truth. And really, I wanted people to experience the emotions and not feel like I was just regurgitating them. Mm-hmm. That's exactly what I did.
Well, with such a cogent talk, it's pretty apparent to me that you're very good at improvisational, extemporaneous speaking, as well as you had a very, very high concept of what you were going to talk about, as you put it, not what you were going to specifically say.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It was the spirit of the conversation, and I knew that walking into it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What's a tip, tool, or technique that you would recommend?
Don't write your speech down.
Oh, of course.
And that's what I was saying a minute ago. I mean, I, for the first time, realized two primary things from my TED Talk that I think I've carried into speeches that I've given after that. Number one, as I said, do not write the speech down. Write down a loose outline and live within a predefined format, but let yourself free or flow freely within that format. That's first thought. Second thought is cut out any language that a sixth grader or below could not understand. I think people have this idea in their head that they need to use big, fancy mm-hmm. words to be able to communicate a really powerful message. But the most powerful messages are the one that every single person in the audience can feel and comprehend. Well, absolutely. And I mean, that's the power of the TED and branded talk format, is that when it's done really, true to the spirit of it, you're going to have people, some of whom we don't know of, some of whom we do know of, some of whom are at the very top of their fields, and they're going to use common language that everybody can understand instead of siloed or expert language. And that's a really, really important thing. You see it all the time when people give a TED Talk and they share their TED Talk, and it's like, whoa, you didn't take the jargon and the lingo out of it. And we know that you're at the top of your field, but did you really connect? Did you really enter into the spirit of a true TED Talk? I see a lot where they didn't. They gave a good presentation or their normal keynote or something like that, or a technical death by bullet point presentation, even in a couple, which you're really not supposed to do. But to really connect with people, you got to take all that expert silo language, throw it aside. Have a conversation with the audience is my thought. And my second and final note in this is, if you really want to be inspired on how to give a powerful TED Talk, political beliefs aside, watch how Barack Obama used to do it when he was in office. One of the best speakers of our time, in my personal opinion. Never for a moment did it feel like he was rehearsed, and that's what made him so great.
Yeah, it's that balance between spontaneity and actual hidden preparedness, where it actually connects in a powerful way.
I call it pseudo-empathy.
Pseudo-empathy.
Mm-hmm. Where you create an environment, and a lot of political leaders do this. You create an environment where you're really communicating a lot of empathy, even though there may have been some hidden structures going into that conversation. Okay, yeah, that the explanation sounded more generous than the actual term on the surface. So thank you for explaining that. And you know what? I mean, to your point, Kyle, I mean, there are so many times as business leaders or political leaders, or, leadership requires that you have to communicate, and you may or may not be feeling it, but the people need to be, led in an integrous way that, regardless of whether we're feeling a certain way or not. So we have to connect with people in the most authentic way that we can. So I think that that's a pretty cogent statement that you just made. Here's my last question for you, Kyle. What is the most unexpected, strange, or just plain weird thing that happened during or right before your talk? Great question. Well, like most TED Talks, I wasn't the only one that was on stage that day. And maybe 2 or 3 speakers before me, there was a young boy by the name of Riley, about 7 or 8 years old. And he was speaking about an international sports organization that he had started in Africa. that was helping to empower some of the underserved communities of that country. And of course, seeing a 7-year-old or 8-year-old in the speaker lineup, I was like, well, this is just going to be a complete botched speech. As it turned out, it was one of the most impactful things that I have ever heard. And I think it was unexpected in the sense that he was so young, but what made it so unique was the fact that he was so young, and it didn't throw any of us off in terms of the other speakers, but I think it gave us wind beneath our wings to see someone so young making that great of an impact in the world.
So would you call or describe him as using pseudo-empathy in the positive way that you define that?
I think a little bit, sure. Yeah. I mean, I think his attitude was when you heard him speak, he had given this speech before, and that's why communicating emotion sometimes feels a little bit regurgitated. Mm-hmm. But what was so interesting with him is that, again, he just spoke from a place of wholeness. He was someone that's you can tell he's just so fulfilled by what he does. And so because of that, it just seeped out of him, the love for what his passion.
Well, we've been enjoying the Blitz Round with Kyle Herron. His talk is called More Than Solo Cups and Studies. You can find out more about Kyle at BeTheTalk.com. We'll have a link to his talk as well as the LinkedIn profile that he has. And it looks like his website is kyleherron.me. Is that right, Kyle?
That's correct.
That I see right there, Kyle Herron, HERRON.me. And we're going to be right back with Kyle Herron's final word of advice in just a moment. And we're back. It's time for the final word of advice from Kyle Herron.
Final word of advice is something that you've probably heard once or twice before, but pursue your passion with absolute vigor and do it in a way that challenges conventional wisdom, allows you to collaborate widely, and allows you to think broadly. Because if you can bring those three components together, you've now embraced something that is so important to me, and that's the spirit of entrepreneurship. Recognizing that you don't have to be a CEO, you don't have to be a founder, you don't even have to have a great idea, but you do have to be someone that constantly chases your dreams. And your dreams may land you in community college, they might land you in a great university, or they might land you in neither. But wherever it takes you, the bottom line is you're going to be living within the field that you're supposed to be in.
Well, Kyle Herron, thank you so much for coming on the talk today and sharing your wisdom with Talk Universe.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Be The Talk. For tips and resources to help you change the world, go to BeTheTalk.com. See you tomorrow.